Nora Caldwell bought the land on a Tuesday. The county assessor's office smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, and the man behind the counter, Roger Penton, 58 years old, suspenders, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, looked at the cashier's check. She slid across the desk like she had just handed him a note written in crayon. $12.17. He picked it up, held it to the fluorescent light above his head like he was checking it for forgery. Set it back down. "You're serious," he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at the plat map spread open on the counter between them. 19.3 acres. Clatsop County, Oregon. Parcel 4-7-22. Described in the county record as seasonal wetland. No structures, no utilities, no road access, floods annually from late October through April. He tapped the parcel outline with the eraser end of a pencil that had been chewed down to nothing. "Can't build on it," he said. "Can't farm it. Can't graze it without sinking to your knees in March." "I know. Been tax delinquent since 2011. 8 years we've been trying to move this parcel." "I know that too." He leaned back in his chair until it creaked. "How old are you?" 20. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the check again. Then he stamped the deed transfer without another word, slid the paper across the counter, and shook his head in the slow, private way of a man who had seen enough strange things in his career that this no longer surprised him, only saddened him slightly. Nora folded the deed into her coat pocket and walked out into the rain. March in Clatsop County arrived the way it always did, gray and wet and indifferent. The kind of cold that didn't bite so much as settle, finding its way into the gap between your collar and your neck and staying there all day. She walked to her truck, a 1998 Chevy with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked only when it felt like it, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. She held the deed in both hands. Parcel 4-7-22. 19.3 acres of swamp. Her grandfather, Elias Caldwell, had died 4 months earlier, November 14th, 2018. Lung cancer, quiet about it until the last 6 weeks, the way he had been quiet about most things his entire life. He was 78 years old. He had lived on the same 8 acres outside Vernonia for 41 years in a 1947 craftsman house with a good well, a barn you could stand up straight in, and a mortgage from Cascade Regional Bank that had been 4 payments behind when Nora arrived in December to go through his things. He had left her everything: the house, the land, the barn, the 1952 Farmall Cub tractor that hadn't run in 20 years, the wood stove, the cast iron pan hanging above it, the jar of pencils on the kitchen windowsill, the reading chair by the front window worn through at the armrests, the shelf of almanacs above the desk, each one marked in the margins in Elias's handwriting, the tools on the pegboard in the barn, hung in the particular order of a man who believed there was a correct place for everything and had spent decades figuring out what that order was. All of it, and $73,000 in debt. She had been working doubles at the feed store in Vernonia since January, 6 days a week, opening at 6, closing the register at 8, driving home in the dark with mud on her boots and flour dust in her hair. The math didn't work. She knew it didn't work. The bank had been polite about it so far, the way banks are polite before they stop being polite. And the property tax notice that arrived in February made it clear that polite had an expiration date somewhere around June. She was going to lose the place by summer. She had known it for weeks and had kept working anyway. The way you keep doing a thing when stopping feels worse than continuing, even if continuing doesn't make sense. She got up at 5. She drove to the feed store in the dark. She worked until the muscles in her lower back made themselves known in a specific, persistent way. She drove home. She ate whatever required the fewest dishes. She sat in Elias's chair by the window and looked at the account books until the numbers stopped meaning anything, and then she went to bed and got up and did it again. She had not cried since the funeral. She wasn't built for crying in the way some people aren't built for it. Not because they feel less, but because feeling more, leaves no room for it. The grief was there. It had been there every morning since November, sitting in the kitchen, when she came downstairs, sitting in the barn, when she went to check on things, sitting in the chair that still held the shape of the man who had spent 40 years in it. She moved around it the way you move around furniture in the dark by feel, without looking directly at it. That was the situation on the morning of March 12, 2019, when she drove to the county assessor's office with $12.17 and bought 19 acres of swamp. She wasn't sure even then that she fully understood why. Only that Elias had done it first. The reading of the will had been held at the office of a lawyer named Clifton Barr, downtown Astoria, second floor. A room that smelled like lemon polish and old ambition. The building was on Commercial Street, 3 blocks from the river, the kind of building that had been many things over the decades and had settled into being a professional services office, the way certain people settle into middle age, without much drama and with a vague sense that something more interesting had been left behind. Nora had sat in a leather chair that was too big for her and listened to Clifton Barr read the document in a flat, practiced voice, while the late November light came through the window at a low angle and made everything in the room look more serious than it probably was. She had not expected anyone else to be there. Dale Mercer arrived 7 minutes late. He was 38 years old and dressed in the particular way of men who want you to know they can afford to dress well without appearing to try. Gray suit, no tie shoes that were too clean for the weather outside. He was the son of Gareth Mercer, who was the son of Elias Caldwell's younger sister, which made Dale a first cousin once removed, which was close enough to matter when there was an estate involved and far enough away to mean nothing when there wasn't. He was a lawyer himself, which Nora had not known until that morning. Family law, primarily with a practice in Portland. He had the posture of someone who spent a great deal of time in rooms like this one, on the other side of the desk, and had learned to make that familiarity feel like authority. He sat down without being invited, crossed one leg over the other, and folded his hands in his lap, with the patience of a man who had already decided how this meeting was going to end. Clifton Barr read the will. Nora got everything. Dale got nothing. Not because Elias had forgotten him. Not because Elias had been confused or unwell or pressured. Because Elias had written his own addendum in his own handwriting, attached to the final page of the document, witnessed and notarized by Clifton Barr himself in September of 2017, 14 months before Elias died, when he had been, as Clifton Barr read aloud in the same flat voice of sound and disposing mind. The addendum said only this: I have considered the question of Dale Mercer and Gareth Mercer carefully and at length. My decision is final. Dale did not say anything immediately. He sat very still for a moment, looking at the middle distance above Clifton Barr's left shoulder. Then he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that has made its calculation and arrived at a conclusion. He pulled a checkbook from his inside jacket pocket. I'll make this easy, he said. He looked at Nora, not at Clifton Barr, at Nora with the direct evaluating attention of someone sizing up a situation they expect to resolve quickly. $40,000 for the house and the land. Cash equivalent certified check, you can have it by Friday. He set the checkbook on the arm of his chair with a small, deliberate sound. That's a fair price for a property carrying $73,000 in debt. More than fair. You walk away clean. Nora looked at the checkbook, then at Dale. No, she said. He tilted his head slightly. You don't have the income to service that debt. The bank will initiate foreclosure proceedings by June at the latest. I'm offering you a way out. I heard you, Nora said. No. He held her gaze for a moment, looking for something. Whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. Dale picked up the checkbook and put it back in his pocket with the same small, deliberate sound. He stood up, buttoned his jacket one button at a time. The bank doesn't negotiate, he said. I do. When you change your mind, you have my number. He left without saying goodbye to Clifton Barr, which told Nora everything she needed to know about how Dale Mercer moved through the world and what he thought of the people in it who couldn't do anything for him. She drove home to Vernonia in the dark, both hands on the wheel, the heater blowing lukewarm air at her feet. She thought about the $40,000. She thought about the 73,000 in debt. She thought about the way Dale had set his checkbook on the arm of the chair like it was a gavel, a small performance of inevitability staged for an audience of one. She thought about her grandfather. Elias Caldwell had not been a man who said much about anything directly. He showed things instead. He had shown her how to read weather by the color of the sky at 5 in the morning, how to set a fence post so it didn't heave in the frost, how to listen to an engine and hear what it was telling you before it told you in more expensive terms. He had never once said the words, "I love you," in her hearing, but he had driven 4 hours each way every Thanksgiving to bring her back to the farm from whatever temporary situation she was in at the time, and he had done it every year from the time she was 7 years old without being asked and without making anything of it. Her mother had left when Nora was 3. Her father had left when she was 7. Elias had shown up on the day her father left in the same truck he always drove, and had put her bag in the back and said simply that she would come stay with him for a while, and the while had stretched to years, and the years had become the foundation of everything she knew about how to be in the world. She pulled into the gravel drive and cut the engine. She sat in the dark for a while. By the time she got out of the truck and walked up the porch steps and pushed open the front door that still stuck slightly in cold weather, she had made a decision that she couldn't fully explain and didn't try to. She was going to stay. The first 2 months were the kind of difficult that doesn't arrive all at once. It builds in layers. A broken water line in January that cost her $300 she didn't have, and 2 days of work she couldn't afford to miss. A busted belt on the truck in February that she fixed herself with a borrowed socket set and a YouTube video she watched 4 times before she understood it. 3 consecutive weeks of rain that turned the driveway to soup and made the lower field completely impassable, so that getting to the barn each morning required a route that added 10 minutes and ruined a pair of boots. She fixed what she could fix herself and left what she couldn't, and kept going to work at the feed store 6 days a week, and came home and ate whatever required the fewest dishes and fell asleep in Elias's reading chair most nights, because the chair was warm and the bedroom upstairs felt very large and very quiet. She slept under the quilt Elias had kept folded over the armrest his whole adult life. It was a heavy quilt, older than she was, the fabric worn smooth in the places where his hands had rested. She pulled it around herself each evening and told herself it was practical that the downstairs was warmer than the upstairs, that this was a sensible arrangement and nothing more than that. She was still eating his canned goods. The root cellar outside was full of them jars he had put up himself, beans and tomatoes and pickled things. The lids dated in his handwriting on strips of masking tape. She worked through them methodically, oldest first, the way he had always done it, and tried not to think about the fact that once they were gone, there would not be more. She found the notebook in the barn on the last Saturday of February. She had been trying to get the farm all running not because she needed the tractor immediately, but because doing something with her hands in the cold was better than sitting with the account books in the kitchen, staring at numbers that didn't improve under scrutiny. The farm all sat in the back corner of the barn, under a tarp that had been there so long it had partially fused to the machine beneath it. She peeled it back in sections, careful not to tear it, and looked at the engine with the pragmatic attention of someone who knows nothing about old engines, but is willing to learn and has enough mechanical intuition to know where to start. The wooden crate was underneath the chassis, pushed back against the rear axle, half buried under 4 decades of barn dust and mouse nesting material, and the general accumulation of a space that had been used hard and organized carefully and then left alone. She almost missed it entirely. Her boot caught the corner of it while she was crouching to look at the undercarriage, and it made a sound that was wrong, dense and solid where she had expected hollow or nothing. She pulled it out. The crate was pine hand-built, the boards fitted together with the same quiet precision Elias applied to everything he made. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth tied with a length of brown twine, was a book. She unwrapped it slowly. Leather cover cracked at the spine, the color of old tobacco. The leather had dried and contracted over the years, but held. She opened it to the first page with the careful touch you use for things that have been waiting a long time to be handled again. Elias Caldwell's handwriting. Blue ink faded to the color of shallow water. Tight, slanted, economical. The handwriting of a man who never used two words when one would serve. April 9th, 1968. Bought the Nehalem tract today. 19 acres. Paid the back taxes. $11.50. Nobody wanted it. Let them laugh. She read that line 3 times. 3. She sat down on the barn floor with a notebook in her lap, the cold coming up through the concrete into her legs, the gray February light coming in through the slats at a low angle. She turned the page. The next 40 pages were dense with information she didn't immediately understand. Topographic sketches rendered in pencil with a precision that spoke of time and care, and someone who had taught himself to see the land in a particular technical way. Water flow diagrams showing seasonal movement through the property at different times of year, the lines annotated with abbreviations she would need to decode. Sediment layer cross-sections drawn in profile, the strata labeled and numbered. Depth measurements taken at specific coordinates marked with a system of letters and numbers she didn't yet have the key to. Gravel composition notes describing the size and shape and color of the material at various locations. And in the margins, scattered throughout, in the spaces between drawings, fragments in his slanted script. Gold moves downstream, always has always will, just have to know where it stops. She read without moving for 2 hours. The light through the barn slats moved from gray to orange to nothing, and by the time she stood up, her legs had stiffened with cold, and she had to hold the barn wall to get her balance. She stood there for a moment with the notebook pressed against her chest, looking at the farmall, at the pegboard of tools at the barn she had known her whole life and thought she understood. She understood 3 things now that she had not understood when she woke up that morning. First, Elias Caldwell had spent the better part of 30 years carefully and systematically mapping the water movement through 19 acres of wetland that every county official who had ever looked at the plat map had written off as worthless. Second, he had not done this for no reason. The notebook was too careful, too sustained, too deliberate to be the product of idle curiosity. This was the record of a man with a specific theory and the patience to test it over decades. Third, the 19 acres he had mapped was parcel 4-7-22, the same parcel she had bought 12 days ago for $12.17 from a county assessor who had shaken his head as he stamped the deed. She went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her and read it again, this time more slowly, working through the abbreviations with a pencil and a piece of paper, building a small key for herself as she went. By midnight, she had decoded most of it. By 2 in the morning, she had a rough understanding of what Elias had been looking for. By 4, when the coffee was gone and the house had gone cold around her, she knew she needed to look at the historical survey records. She drove into Astoria the next morning. The county assessor's office kept its historical records in a back room accessed through a door marked staff only that Donna, the woman at the front desk, unlocked without comment after Nora explained what she was looking for. The room held filing cabinets from 3 different decades, a single long table under a bare fluorescent tube, and the particular smell of old paper and whatever chemical had been used on it over the years to keep it from deteriorating faster than it already was. Donna returned 20 minutes later with a rolled tube of linen paper, brittle at the outer edges, tied with a cloth ribbon that had once been red and was now the color of old brick. Survey map, Clatsop County, original plat, 1891. Nora spread it carefully across the table, weighting the corners with her palms. The land was labeled in a surveyor's formal hand at the top of the document, Tract 7 Nehalem Flats. Unsuitable for agriculture. Seasonal inundation. No commercial value identified. Below that notation, the land was divided into parcels, each one outlined in ink, that had faded from black to dark brown. Most of the parcels had been purchased and developed in the decades since. Roads ran through them now. Farms, a subdivision on the eastern edge. But Parcel 7, the one that would eventually become 4722, in the county's modern numbering system, sat at the center of the map with no notation of purchase or development. Just the outline and the label, and below it in smaller script, the notation added by the surveyor himself. H. Caldwell Survey, completed March 1891. Creek diverted 1889 following spring flood event. Original channel runs northeast through parcel. Gravel deposit estimated significant at depth. No surface access to channel bed. She traced the line with her finger across the old linen paper. The original creek before it had been rerouted by a flood, and then by county drainage work done in the years after had run northeast through the center of what was now her 19 acres. It had bent east near the northern boundary, following a natural low in the terrain, before curving out toward the Malure property line and continuing east off the edge of the map. When a creek is diverted, the old channel bed doesn't disappear. The water leaves. The gravel stays. The bends and the inside curves where water slows and drops its load, where heavier material settles and accumulates over years into concentrated deposits, those stay too. They stay for a very long time. She asked Donna for a copy. Donna charged her $4. That afternoon, Nora walked the land with the 1891 survey in one hand and Elias's notebook in the other. The ground was the kind of wet that has opinions about footwear. She wore the tall rubber boots she had found in the mudroom, an inch too big, and moved slowly, testing the ground ahead of each step with a walking stick she had cut from a willow branch at the property edge. The air smelled like wet soil and the particular green smell of standing water and the cold undersmell of February mud that hasn't thawed fully yet. She followed the depression in the earth where the old channel would have been reading the topography the way Elias's 40 pages of drawings had taught her to read it. The land wasn't flat. Nothing looks flat until you learn to see it. The ground dipped in a long, gradual curve, subtle enough that you would walk across it a dozen times without noticing if you weren't paying attention to the right things. Willows had clustered at the low points, their roots finding the water table. Cattails grew in dense, wind-bent mats where the ground was softest. She moved northeast through them, stepping over rotted logs and skirting the soft spots that appeared without warning. She found the first ridge about 300 yards in from the property edge. It ran perpendicular to the current drainage flow. 15 feet wide, she judged perhaps a little less a low spine of gravel and packed clay, rising just a few inches above the surrounding terrain, enough to see only if you knew to look for it, and to look for it only if you knew what it meant. Exactly where Elias had marked what he called bar number 1 in his notebook, with a small symbol she had decoded as his notation for primary deposit. She crouched beside it. She dug with her hands, pushing into the wet soil beside the ridge, feeling the texture change as she went deeper. At 6 inches, the composition shifted from the dark, organic topsoil of the wetland surface to something coarser, darker, mixed with smooth river stones rounded by water movement, the diameter of her thumb worn into the shapes that only happen after a long time in a moving current. She scooped a handful into the mason jar she had carried from the kitchen that morning, feeling slightly self-conscious about it as she did. Conscious that this was either the beginning of something real or the beginning of a story she would tell herself later about how she had spent her 21st year. She held the jar up against the flat gray sky. Something caught the light. She turned the jar slightly. The something moved. Multiple somethings distributed through the silt and sand and fine gravel, catching the light with the particular quality of a material that doesn't flash or throw light back, but simply holds it differently from everything around it. Not shiny, not reflective, just present in a way that everything else around it was not. She looked at the jar for a long time without moving. Then she walked back to the house. She drove into Vernonia that afternoon and bought a plastic gold pan from the hardware store on Main Street. $12. The man behind the counter, whose name tag read Wendell Spruce, had a Pioneer seed cap and the permanent squint of a man who had spent his working life outdoors and had stopped being curious about what customers were buying years ago. He looked at the pan, he looked at her, he set it in a bag without a word. She also bought a jeweler's loupe, the kind used for examining stamps or coins, and a set of small plastic vials with screw-top lids. The total came to $31. She paid in cash from the envelope she kept in the truck's glove box. Back at the house, she filled a 5-gallon bucket from the hose and set it on the porch. She scooped the soil from the mason jar into the pan, added water, began to swirl. She had watched prospecting videos on her phone until nearly 1 in the morning the previous night, methodical about it. The way she was methodical about most things she didn't know but needed to know quickly, watching each video twice, paying attention to the angle of the pan and the speed of the swirl and the way the practiced hands in the frame moved without thinking, because they had done this motion 10,000 times and it had become as natural as breathing. Knowing the motion and being able to execute it were different things. The first attempt lost everything over the edge before she had completed 2 full rotations. The second attempt was better but still wrong. The material moving too fast, the lighter sediment, and the heavier material leaving together instead of separating. The third attempt was closer. On the fourth, she found the angle, the speed, the slight forward tilt that let the water carry the lighter material over the rim, while the heavier material dragged against the bottom of the pan and stayed. She watched the lighter material wash away in small gray waves, and then she saw them. 3 specks, smaller than grains of sand, sitting in the curved bottom of the pan with the absolute stillness of material that is too heavy to move, unmoved by the water that had carried everything else away, yellow bright in the flat afternoon light in the particular way of gold, which is not shiny exactly, but holds color in a way nothing else does. She used the tip of a toothpick to move them into one of the plastic vials. She loaded the pan again. She ran it through, checked the bottom, 2 specks. She ran it again. 5 specks, these slightly larger. She worked until the light was gone, her back aching from the crouch, her hands cold and wet from the water and the mud. When she finally stood up and carried the pan inside, she had 11 vials on the porch railing, each one with a scattering of material in the bottom. She held them up to the kitchen light one by one. She did the math. At current prices, approximately $1,800 per troy ounce. And at the concentration she was seeing, she had perhaps $6 or $7 of gold in those 11 vials. $6 or $7 from 3 hours of work on one small section of one gravel bar that covered perhaps 1/10 of an acre. But she had 19 acres, and Elias had mapped 43 separate locations. She sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her and the vials lined up in a row and turned to the entry dated April 3rd, 1951, where Elias had recorded a month's yield from what he called the back channel. His notation was brief, the number stated without emphasis. 14 ounces this month. No one needs to know. She sat with that sentence for a long time. 14 ounces. At current prices, that was just over $25,000. From one channel, in 1 month. In 1951, when the gold price was fixed at $35 an ounce, it had been worth $490, which in 1951 had been serious money. She turned pages. 1954. Each year had entries from spring through fall when the water was right for working the channels. The yields varied, some months better than others, the notation always the same, brief and factual. She cross-referenced the locations with the grid in the front of the notebook and saw that Elias had rotated between sites methodically, never working the same location too intensively. Understanding something about the land's capacity to replenish its surface deposits through the slow movement of material from depth. 30 years of entries. The math, even conservative, was staggering. She sat with the notebook and the vials and the math until her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A message from a number she had saved as Clifton Barr Esquire, the lawyer who had read Elias's will in November. Brief and direct, the way Clifton Barr communicated. Call me when you can. Dale Mercer has filed a petition with the court contesting the will on grounds of testamentary incapacity. She set the phone face down on the table. She looked at the vials. She looked at the notebook open to 1953, a year's worth of careful notations in Elias's faded blue ink. She understood what Dale was doing. The petition would claim that Elias had not been mentally capable of executing a valid will, that the document was therefore invalid, that the estate should be distributed under Oregon's intestate succession statutes instead. Under those statutes, Nora, as a granddaughter with no established dependency relationship, would receive a fraction of what the will had left her. Dale, as a blood relative with a more direct legal claim under intestate rules, would receive substantially more, possibly everything depending on how the court found. It was a legal argument and it was built on a foundation of truth, the way all effective lies are, because Elias in his last months had been quieter than usual, slower, had spent more time sitting in his chair, and less time moving through the world. Someone who had not known him well his entire life might have interpreted that as decline. Someone who had known him his entire life would have recognized it as a man who was getting ready to go and was spending his last season doing the things he had always done, but more slowly and with more attention. She picked up her phone and called Clifton Bar. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Tell me what I need to do." He talked for 25 minutes. She listened to all of it, writing notes on the back of an envelope she found in the kitchen drawer, her handwriting getting smaller toward the bottom of the envelope as she ran out of space. When he finished, she thanked him and hung up and sat for a while longer at the table looking at the notes she had made. Then she looked at the vials again. The 3 specks in the first vial, the larger ones in the 7th. The concentration that had come from a single handful of material from a single location on a property that had 19 acres and 43 map sites. Dale Mercer could file whatever he needed to file. She was going to need more information before she could make any of the decisions that were coming. She put the vials in the cabinet under the kitchen sink, tucked behind the cleaning supplies, where they wouldn't be immediately visible to anyone who opened the cabinet casually. She put the notebook in the inside drawer of Elias's desk under a stack of almanacs. She turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. She lay in the dark and thought about the 3 specks in the bottom of the pan sitting there unmoved, while everything around them washed away. She thought about Elias buying 19 acres of worthless swamp in 1968 with $11.50 while everyone laughed. Let them laugh. She turned over and closed her eyes. In the morning, she would build a proper sluice box. She would run every coordinate in the notebook one by one the way Elias had laid them out. She would be systematic about it the way he had been systematic about everything he cared about. She would understand what she had before she decided anything about what to do with it. Outside, the rain had started again. The soft, persistent rain of coastal Oregon in early March, falling on the 8 acres and on the 19 acres beyond them, falling on the gravel bars and the old creek channels, and the things buried in the black mud that had been waiting there patient as the gold itself for someone who knew how to find them. She built the sluice box the following Sunday. She found the lumber in the back of the barn, pine boards stacked flat against the wall behind the farmall, covered with a sheet of plastic Elias had laid over them years ago, and weighed down with a length of steel pipe. The boards were dry and straight the way lumber stays when it has been stored properly for a long time. Elias had kept good wood. He had kept good everything, organized on the principle that the time you spent putting things away correctly was returned to you with interest when you needed them again. She measured the boards against the dimensions she had written out the night before, copied from a prospecting manual she had found available through the county library's digital lending service, and had read cover to cover in a single sitting, making notes in the margins of a legal pad as she went. She cut the boards with the circular saw that hung on the pegboard above the workbench, checking each cut with the square before moving to the next. For the riffles, she drove to the hardware store in Vernonia on Saturday morning and bought aluminum angle stock. Wendell Spruce was behind the counter. He cut the pieces to length on his metal shear without being asked, charged her for the material, and handed her the bag. She thanked him. He nodded and went back to what he had been doing. She assembled the box on the porch, checking the angles twice before setting each screw because the angle of the riffles relative to the flow determined whether fine gold stayed caught or washed through. She had read that passage 3 times the night before and could feel the logic of it in her hands as she worked. What she had not expected was the page she found near the back of Elias's notebook, written in a different pen than the rest, undated, inserted between entries from 1974 and 1976. As though placed there at a later time to be found when it was needed. The page described in his careful technical language the proper construction of a sluice designed to recover fine gold from the specific type of material that characterized the Nehalem Flats deposits. The dimensions were precise. The riffle spacing was specified. The angle was given to the degree. He had left her the instructions. She assembled the box exactly as he described it. By noon, it was done. She carried it out to the property on her shoulder, following the line of the old channel northeast from the property edge, the ground wet and unsteady beneath her boots, using the walking stick to test ahead of each step in the low sections. She set the sluice in the narrow drainage channel along the eastern edge of the first gravel ridge, angled it until the current moved the right way through the riffles, and ran the first bucket. Then the second, then the third. By mid-afternoon, she had the rhythm. Dig, fill the bucket, carry it to the box, feed it through the classifying screen, watch the riffles, clean them into the pan every hour, swirl, check the bottom. The first two buckets gave her nothing she could see with the naked eye. The third gave her 4 specks visible without the loop. The fourth gave her 7. The fifth, from a location about 10 yards south of the first, gave her a pan bottom with color distributed through the lowest curve in a way that was clearly not random. She held the pan up to the sky and looked at it for a long time before she cleaned it into a vial. This was what the notebook called flour gold. Fine as dust, the guide had said. Finer than anything she would be able to pick up between her fingers, the particles small enough that only their specific gravity kept them in the pan at all. The gravel pockets along the old channel bends were full of it, deposited there over decades of water movement before the creek was rerouted and the movement stopped. She kept notes in the back of Elias's journal in her own pencil, using the grid coordinates from the front pages. She was building a map of her own, her observations layered on his, filling in what he had left as outline. The work demanded a quality of attention she had not expected. You could not do it distracted. You could not think about the bank statement or Dale Mercer's legal petition while your hands were in the gravel and your eyes were on the pan. The land required your full mind, or it revealed nothing. She had found this annoying for the first day and had come to appreciate it by the third. The way a problem that forces you into the present tense is different from problems that live in the future, which is where fear lives. She told no one. Not the woman at the feed store who asked with genuine kindness how she was holding up. Not Pastor Elwood when he appeared on a Wednesday evening with a casserole dish and the gentle expression of a man who has heard from the community network that a young woman is alone on a farm with a debt problem and might need checking on. Not Stuart Felling at Cascade Regional Bank, who called on the second Friday of April to discuss the delinquency status of the account in a tone that was still technically polite, but no longer warm. She told Stuart Felling she was working on it and would be in touch very soon. She hung up before he could define soon. She worked the property in sections moving through the grid in the order Elias had established in the notebook. The northern ditch, which ran along the property line and had a different character from the main channel, finer material, less concentrated but present. The stretch behind the barn where the ground stayed wet through July, where the cattails grew so thick you had to push through them, and where the soil beneath them was black and dense, and gave up its color reluctantly. The area along the old fence line, the post long since rotted to nothing but the line of the fence still visible in the way the vegetation had grown 2 different ecologies on either side of an invisible boundary. Some sections gave her color, some gave her nothing. She noted it all and kept moving. On the 14th day, a Thursday, working a section of the back channel that Elias had marked with the notation, Deep Channel 6 feet 1949, she hit something with her shovel that was not bedrock and not clay, and not the packed gravel she had come to recognize by sound and by the way the blade stopped. It was metal. She set the shovel aside and went to her knees. She cleared the gravel with her hands, working carefully and steadily the way you work when you don't yet know what you have, but you know it isn't nothing. A coffee can emerged from the mud. The old style, the kind that predated the pop-top lid with a rolled rim and a body that had been sealed with what once was tar and was now a dark and crumbling crust. The label was long gone, dissolved into the soil around it. But on the exposed metal of the body, someone had written in black marker that had faded to the color of old wood. Elias's handwriting. 1967 to 1969. She carried it back to the house without opening it, set it on the kitchen table, washed the mud from her hands at the sink with the particular care you take when you want to do something properly, dried her hands on the dish towel, stood looking at the can for a moment, Then she sat down and opened it. Inside were 12 leather pouches, each one tied with wax string of the kind used for heavy needlework or canvas repair. She picked up the first pouch. The weight shifted inside it dense and distributed the familiar weight of small metal objects in quantity. She untied the string. Gold. Nuggets mostly some the size of small peas, a few larger the surfaces, rough and irregular, the way alluvial gold is shaped by water and time, and the particular mechanics of erosion. She set them on the kitchen scale, one of the small digital ones she had bought at the Goodwill in February for weighing packages. 41 grams. She opened the second pouch. 38. The third. 52. She stopped counting after the fifth pouch. Her hands were not entirely steady. There had to be close to 500 grams in this can. At current prices, that was something in the neighborhood of $28,000. In a rusted coffee can. In the mud. For 50-odd years. She sat at the kitchen table until the light through the window went from afternoon to evening without her noticing the change. Then she opened the notebook to the entry from April 3rd, 1951, the one she had read the first night, and read it again. 14 ounces this month. No one needs to know. She put the pouches back in the can and put the can in the cabinet under the kitchen sink behind the cleaning supplies with the coffee can of vials. She went to bed. The following morning, she drove to the farm supply in Vernonia and bought a metal detector, a basic model sufficient for the depth she was working, and a pair of heavy waterproof gloves that went to the elbow. She paid cash. She was paying for everything in cash from the envelope in the glove box, which she restocked from her feed store wages each week. She began a systematic sweep of the structures on the property. The barn floor, first the packed earth beneath the concrete sections that Elias had poured in the 1980s when he had the money for it. The detector found 4 signals in the first pass, 3 of which turned out to be old hardware nails and a fragment of what might have been a plow blade. The fourth was a coffee can under 18 inches of packed earth near the northwest corner, smaller than the first one inside it, a collection of Morgan silver dollars wrapped in a square of canvas. She counted them on the kitchen table that evening. 23 coins, most of them from the 1890s and early 1900s, the details still clear under her loupe, the eagles and portraits showing the fine lines that wear removes. She looked them up online and then put the phone face down and sat quietly for a while. The chicken coop came next. It stood behind the house, the wire rusted through, and the frame listing the nesting boxes inside full of years of leaves and field mouse nesting material. She pulled the boxes out one by one, checking underneath and behind each one. Nothing. The last box in the corner had half collapsed inward from rot. When she lifted it, there was a gap in the floorboards beneath it, a cut gap, straight edges. The boards laid back in place with the same deliberate care as the mortarwork in the barn foundation. She pried them up, a smaller can. Inside it, rolls of quarters in paper sleeves, 3 $20 bills from the 1950s still crisp inside a waxed paper envelope, and a folded note. Elias's handwriting. No date. If you found 2, there are more. Keep going. She read it twice, then set it down, then went back to the property with the detector. The third can was under the front porch steps, buried between 2 foundation stones. The detector signal so clear and clean, she found it in less than 10 minutes. The fourth was in the stone foundation of the barn itself, fitted into a gap between 2 courses of limestone and sealed over with mortar that had been color matched to the surrounding stone so carefully that only a close examination revealed it was newer. She chiseled it out with a cold chisel and a hammer, working slowly and precisely, and when the can came free from the wall, she sat back on her heels in the dim barn and held it for a moment before she moved. The fifth can took 3 days. The notebook's notation for it was written in the margin of an entry rather than the main text, the handwriting compressed as though Elias had not wanted it to be the first thing a reader saw on the page. She decoded the location by cross-referencing the notation with the 1891 survey map and a soil composition note from 1973, a process that required several hours at the kitchen table with both documents side by side. The location was in the back field, the one that flooded each spring, 40 yards from the main channel in a depression that held standing water through June most years. She found it on the second day of sweeping the detector signal, muffled by the waterlogged ground. She dug carefully the soil, closing back around the shovel each time she lifted a load, the black mud smelling of deep earth and old water. The can was at 2.5 feet, smaller than the others but heavier. She carried it to the house. Inside, beneath a layer of coins wrapped in oilcloth, was a folded piece of paper. Not a note, a letter. 2 pages of Elias's tight, slanted script dated June 14th, 1981. She read it, she set it down. She read it again. The letter said, among other things, "If you found 5, there are 9 more. The last one needs a key. Don't stop now. I didn't hide this for anyone who stops." And then in the paragraph that followed, "I know who will come after I'm gone. I know what they'll say and what they'll offer and how they'll make it sound reasonable. This land has been in this family since 1921, and everything in it and under it belongs to the person who stays when everyone else decides to leave." That's always been the only test worth giving. She refolded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the can, and put the can with the others under the kitchen sink, and the line of cans there now ranging from the large coffee can of the first find to the small flat tobacco tin of the third, each one a different size and weight and decade of her grandfather's quiet, careful, completely private life. She made coffee and sat at the table with a notebook and her own grid notes and began planning the next section. She found the 6th can beneath the concrete floor of the equipment shed inside a void Elias had created under a poured form, the wood of the form long rotted away, but the void still there, the can resting in it as cleanly as something placed on a shelf. The 7th was in the barn rafters, wrapped in a length of burlap feed sack and wired to the beam in a way that made it look from below like a pad of insulation or a repair. Invisible unless you were up on a ladder looking for it specifically. 8 cans now. She had begun keeping her own total in a separate notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer, the numbers she had weighed and calculated written out in her own hand. She was not ready to add them all up into a final figure yet. The number felt like something that needed to exist in parts for a little longer before she let it become a whole. And then on a Tuesday evening in the 4th week of April, she came back to the property from her shift at the feed store and found a white sedan parked on the county road beyond her gate. 2 men in it, a camera with a telephoto lens extended from the passenger window, aimed at the area behind the barn, where the ground she had been working showed clearly as disturbed earth, the excavation sites visible from the road to anyone who knew what to look for and was looking for it. She drove past without slowing. She watched the camera follow her truck in the rearview mirror. She drove to the bend in the road, pulled over, and sat with the engine idling and her hands on the wheel. She knew who had sent them without having to think about it for more than a second. Dale Mercer had filed a legal petition. Now he was building a case. He needed evidence of irregular activity on the property, something that could be characterized as unpermitted extraction, as financial behavior inconsistent with a young woman who was supposedly about to lose everything to the bank. He needed something that would tell him whether there was a reason beyond sentiment that she was refusing his offer and refusing to move. He had sent someone to find out what she was doing on the land. She sat on the county road for 20 minutes thinking through what this meant and what it changed and what she needed to do about it. Then she drove back to the house, went inside, and called Clifton Barr. She told him about the notebook in full detail sitting at the kitchen table with it open in front of her. She told him about the cans, all 8 of them, what each one had contained. She told him the total she had calculated in her separate notebook, the figure she had been keeping to herself because saying it out loud made it more real, and more real meant more at stake. There was a long pause on Clifton Barr's end of the line. Then he told her what she needed to do, step by step, practical and specific, the way he gave all his advice. She wrote it down. After she hung up, she went to the cabinet under the kitchen sink and looked at the row of cans for a while. Then she turned and looked at the mudroom shelf by the back door where Elias had kept the things he used regularly. His hat on the top hook, the brim curved by years of being picked up the same way. His work gloves on the shelf below, stiffened now with dried mud and disuse. a broken compass he had never thrown away because it had belonged to someone before him, a jar of fence staples, and two pairs of boots, the tall rubber ones she had been wearing since December, and a pair of leather work boots cracked at the toe box, the leather darkened with decades of lanolin, in the particular dark color that comes from years of field mud. The leather boots. She had worn the rubber ones because they fit better. She had left the leather ones where Elias had left them because they felt, without her having examined this feeling directly, like something that should stay in its place until she understood more about what she was standing in the middle of. She crossed to the mudroom. She picked up the right boot, turned it over in her hands. The sole was thick original leather, the kind made for a working life rather than a season, and along the inner edge of the heel where the welt met the upper, there was a seam that was not part of the original construction. A cut precise, sealed with a thin line of adhesive that had dried to the color of the surrounding leather and was invisible unless you were turning the boot over in your hands, specifically looking for something that shouldn't be there. She worked the seam open with her thumbnail. Inside the hollow heel, wrapped in a square of oilcloth the size of a playing card, was a brass key. Small, old. The kind machined for a specific padlock design common in the mid-20th century. On the oilcloth in pencil in Elias's handwriting. Root cellar. You earned it. She stood in the mudroom for a long moment, the key warm in her palm, the oilcloth open in her other hand. She looked at his handwriting. She looked at the key. She had walked past the root cellar door every day since December. It was set into the slope behind the house, a heavy wooden door swollen and settled into the ground at an angle, sealed with a padlock so rusted at the shackle that she had assumed the key was long gone. She had not tried to open it because it had felt like something that should wait. She walked out the back door. The evening was cold and clear, the first truly clear sky in 2 weeks, the light going from pale blue to deep above the fir line. She crossed the yard and crouched in front of the root cellar door. The padlock was rusted at the body in the shackle, but the keyhole had a protective cover plate that had kept the mechanism dry. She inserted the key, felt the tumblers resist, then align, then release a sequence of small mechanical events that ended with the shackle swinging free. A single clean motion, as smooth as if the lock had been oiled yesterday. She lifted the door. It was heavy with the weight of old wood that has absorbed decades of weather, and she propped it open with the cinder block that had been sitting at the side of the opening for as long as she could remember, as if Elias had put it there for exactly this use. Stone steps led down into the dark. She turned on her phone's light and went down. The air at the bottom was cool and mineral and dry in a way that surprised her. Not the cold damp of an enclosed underground space, but the steady, even coolness of limestone that stays the same temperature regardless of what the surface is doing. The walls were hand-cut stone, fitted without mortar in the old dry stack method, the kind of construction that predated the house above it and would likely outlast whatever came after. She moved the light along the back wall. 3 wooden shelves, floor to ceiling, running the full width of the cellar. On them, arranged in rows with the particular care of a person who has thought carefully about how this should look when it is finally seen, were mason jars, 17 of them. The old thick glass kind, the glass with a slight blue cast, and small bubbles trapped in the walls, sealed with metal lids rusted at the threads but still holding. She picked up the nearest jar. Silver dollars inside, packed tight, the coins throwing back the light of her phone in small, cold flashes. The jar next to it held more coins, different denominations. The one after that held rolled bills, 50s and 100s in bundles, the rubber bands long since rotted to dust, so that the rolls had relaxed and spread against the glass. She stood in front of the shelves without moving. 17 jars. She didn't open them. She didn't count them yet. She moved the light slowly from left to right, taking in each jar, and tried to hold the scale of it without letting it overwhelm her, the way you hold your breath when something is too large to take in all at once. Elias had been putting things in this cellar for 30 years. Not spending any of it, not telling anyone, not touching it again once it was placed here, sealed and stored, and waiting in the dark below the house he had lived in, his entire adult life on a piece of land he had tended for more than 4 decades, keeping everything running on what the land gave him through the conventional channels, the fields and the animals, and the careful management of what he had while this other thing accumulated in the dark below. She sat down on the bottom step. The flashlight was warm in her hand. She could see through the gap of the propped open door above her, the last of the light going out of the sky. A cold night coming, the kind of cold that would put frost on the lower fields by morning. She thought about the letter from 1981. Everything in it and under it belongs to the person who stays when everyone else decides to leave. She had stayed, she was staying. She climbed the steps and sat on the edge of the opening with her feet on the top step and looked out across the yard toward the barn and the swamp beyond it. Lying out there in the last of the evening light, 19 acres of dark Oregon ground, full of things that Elias Caldwell had spent the better part of his adult life deciding she deserved to find. 9 more cans, the letter had said. The last one needs a key. She had found the key. She had opened the cellar. But the note said the last one, singular, a specific thing in a specific location. The cellar was not the last one. The cellar was the door to the last one. Somewhere on the property, or in the ground beneath it, there was a final container. And whatever Elias had put in it was the thing he had decided to save for last. She turned the brass key over in her fingers. She put it back in her coat pocket. She closed the cellar door and reset the padlock through the hasp and walked back to the house. At the kitchen table, she opened the notebook to the grid she had been building in the back pages and started reading backward from the last dated entry, looking for something she had missed. She read for 3 hours. It was the kind of attention that moves in a different direction from normal reading, looking for what is absent rather than what is present. Noticing the gaps and the inconsistencies in the places where the structure of the thing is slightly different from what came before. Elias had written his entries in chronological order, April 1968 through September 1981, and she had read them in that order twice. But reading backward revealed what she had missed both times going forward. Behind the last dated entry, separated from it by 3 blank pages she had assumed were simply the end of the record, there was one more entry. Written on the inside back cover of the notebook itself in different ink, darker and more deliberate, the handwriting the same but slower, as if each word had been given its full consideration before it was committed to the page. No date. It said, the back channel splits at the old split oak. Northeast fork, follow it to where the bedrock rises. You will feel the ground change underfoot before you see it. Dig at the base of the rock face north side 4 feet. What is there is what I saved for last. The letter is with it. Read the letter before you do anything else. She set the notebook down. She looked at her reflection in the dark kitchen window, a young woman at an old table with a flashlight in her hand and a notebook that had just told her where to go next. The split oak. She knew exactly which tree it was. A white oak at the back of the 19 acres, old enough that its canopy spread 20 feet in every direction, split at the main trunk into 2 equal forks by a lightning strike that had not killed it, but had divided it permanently. She had noted it in her own grid as a landmark. She had not considered it as a destination. She turned on the overhead light. She made coffee. She found the split oak on her map and traced the line of the back channel northeast from it until it reached the area where her own field notes said the ground changed character, where the vegetation shifted from the wetland species to the lower growth that indicated proximity to bedrock. She had not worked that section yet. She went to bed at midnight. She was up before 5. The morning was cold and clear, a hard frost on the lower fields, the grass stiff and white, the mud in her excavation sites frozen solid in the shapes her boots and shovel had made the day before. She dressed in layers, the rubber boots and the canvas work pants. She had belted tight the wool sweater under the canvas jacket. She took the long shovel, the metal detector, and the notebook. She took the brass key. She walked the back channel northeast from the split oak, moving at a steady pace. The frost-stiffened ground easier to cross than usual, the light coming up ahead of her through the fir trees at the eastern edge of the property in long flat beams. She felt the ground change before she saw the rock. exactly as he had written it. The soil shifted under her boots from the soft, uncertain give of the channel bed to something firmer, more resistant, the ground rising slightly under her feet, and then ahead of her, the basalt outcrop appeared from the slope, low and dark, and moss-covered no more than 4 feet high, but solid in the way of very old things that have been in one place for a very long time. She walked around to the north face. Here the rocks sheltered the ground from the prevailing weather, and the frost was lighter, the soil drier than the surrounding terrain. She turned on the metal detector and swept it slowly across the base of the rock face, moving methodically from left to right, listening. The signal came at the third pass. Clean and strong and specific, the tone of a solid, intact object at depth, rather than the scattered chatter of dispersed or fragmented material. She set the detector aside and picked up the shovel. 4 feet in ground close to bedrock. The first 18 inches came up easily, dark, loamy soil, rich with the organic material of the wetland. Below that, the composition changed, more clay, more resistance, the shovel requiring her full weight on each push and a twisting lift to break each load free. She worked steadily, resting when she needed to rest, checking her depth periodically with the marked handle of the shovel. At 3 feet 8 inches, the blade stopped. The sound it made was not the sound of bedrock. It was deeper, more resonant. She set the shovel aside and went to her knees and used her hands to clear the remaining soil, working carefully, her fingers finding the edges of the object in the clay. It was a metal box, not a coffee can. A document box, the kind common in the mid-20th century for storing papers of importance, approximately the size of a shoebox, made of heavier gauge steel than the cans. The outside was rusted, but the seam where the lid met the body had been sealed with the same tar compound she had found on the first coffee can, and the seal had held. She lifted it out with both hands. She did not open it there. She carried it back to the house the way she had carried everything else, deliberately, without rushing, her boots crunching on the frost, the morning light coming full and clear through the firs. Now the day properly started, the frost beginning to soften at the edges. She set the box on the kitchen table. She made coffee. She sat down and looked at the box for a moment. Then she picked up the flathead screwdriver and worked the clasp, which was frozen with rust but not locked, working carefully until the tongue released and the lid came free. Inside on top was an envelope. Plain white, the paper yellowed to cream, sealed with wax. Written on the front in Elias's handwriting, 2 words. Read first. She set it aside. Beneath it were 2 more items. The first was a second envelope, manila thick with papers, the metal clasp bent closed. On the front in Elias's handwriting, a year and 2 initials. 2009, G.M. Gareth Mercer, Dale's father. She set the manila envelope beside the white one. She picked up the white envelope and opened it. The letter inside was 4 pages written on the same lined paper as the notebook entries, but in a hand that was slower and more deliberate than the field notes, each sentence weighted and considered. It was dated November 2nd, 2016, 2 years before Elias died. She read the whole thing without stopping. Elias had written it in full knowledge that he was sick, though he did not name the sickness, referring to it only as the thing that had been making itself at home in his chest since last spring, a phrasing she recognized as characteristic of a man who refused to give more importance to a thing than it deserved. He had written it at this table. He mentioned the table, the jar of pencils on the windowsill, the sound the furnace made when the temperature dropped outside. Details so specific and domestic that reading them felt intimate in a way she was not sure she was entitled to. He wrote, "I know you will come back. I have always known. Your mother left when you were 3, and your father left when you were 7, and I never said directly what I thought about that, or what I thought you were, or what this place would always be for you, because saying it would have made it something fragile, and it was not fragile. It was the most solid thing I knew. You were the most solid thing I knew. You did not need me to tell you that. You needed me to show you, and I tried." She stopped reading. She looked at the jar of pencils on the windowsill. She kept reading. He wrote about the land, not the gold specifically, but the land itself, The way he had come to understand it over decades, the way it behaved differently in wet years and dry years. The way the same gravel bar that was empty one spring could be concentrated the next, after a winter flood moved things. He wrote about the work as something that had become its own justification, the kind of work that changes a person over years in ways they don't notice, until one day they look at their hands and realize they know things their mind hasn't named yet. He wrote about the Nehalem tract, the 19 acres he had bought for $11.50 in 1968, while the men at the assessor's office looked at him the way Roger Penton had looked at Nora 51 years later, with the particular mixture of pity and dismissal reserved for people who seem not to understand how the world works. Then he wrote about Gareth and Dale. He wrote plainly in the tone of a man making a factual record rather than building an argument. In the spring of 2009, he had noticed that a 4-acre parcel on the western edge of his property had been surveyed without his knowledge. He had gone to the county assessor's office and asked to see the survey record. In the file was a power of attorney document granting Gareth Mercer the legal authority to act on Elias Caldwell's behalf in property matters. The document bore Elias's signature. He had not signed it. He had recognized the forgery, the way you recognize your own handwriting, being impersonated, which is immediately and completely and with a cold clarity that does not require analysis. The signature was close. The pen pressure was right. The specific way Elias slanted his capital C had been studied and approximated. But it was not his. Gareth had always had good hands for detail. Elias had known this since they were young. He had gone to the county clerk. He had examined the document. He had used the disposable camera he kept in the glove box of his truck for documenting fence line damage after storms, and he had photographed every page of the power of attorney. He had driven to Astoria and found a notary named Francis Ogle, who worked from a shipping supply store on Commercial Street and who notarized a sworn statement in which he described what he had found and attested that the signature was not his. He had put the photographs in the sworn statement in the manila envelope. He had not gone to the police. He wrote, "I thought about it a long time. Going to the sheriff with what I had would have started something I could not finish on my own. Gareth would deny it. Dale would support him. They would hire people who were better at this than anything I could afford, and they would bury it. And I would spend whatever time I had left in a fight I could not win while telling the county exactly how much this swamp was worth to me and why. I decided to let it wait. Some things are better resolved by the land than by the law, and the land has more patience than the law does. I put what I had somewhere only the right person would find it. I trusted the land to determine who that person would be." She set the letter down. She looked at the manila envelope. 2009. GM. Evidence of document fraud collected and preserved by Elias Caldwell. In the spring of 2009, sealed in a metal box 4 feet underground at the base of a basalt outcrop on the northeastern edge of a 19-acre wetland that the county had written off as worthless and tried to sell for 8 years before a 20-year-old girl bought it for $12.17. She picked the letter up again and read the final paragraph. He wrote, "You will want to be angry. I understand that. Be angry for a while and then put it away because anger is expensive, and what is in that envelope is worth more to someone calm than to someone angry. Find Clifton Barr. Show him the envelope first before anyone else. Let him tell you what it means and what to do with it. Then make your decisions one at a time the way you do everything worth doing, and do not sell the land. Not to Dale, not to anyone. The land chose you. Honor that." And below that, written slightly apart from the rest, the spacing different as if added after a pause. "I am sorry I did not say it more plainly while I was alive. You were always the one." She sat at the kitchen table for a very long time. The jar of pencils was on the windowsill exactly where it had always been. The furnace made its sound in the wall as the morning temperature rose and the thermostat clicked off. The light through the window was full and clear, the frost outside dissolving in the early sun, the field beyond the barn returning to its ordinary green-gray. She folded the letter back along its creases. She picked up her phone and called Clifton Barr at 9 o'clock. He answered on the second ring. She said, "I need to see you today. I have something you need to look at." He said he had a cancellation at 11. She drove to Astoria with the white envelope and the manila envelope tucked inside her coat, one against each side of her chest. She sat across from Clifton Barr's desk and placed both envelopes on the polished wood between them and told him in order what each one contained. Then she told him about the notebook. She told him about the cans, all 11 of them by that point. She told him the total she had calculated, the complete figure she had been keeping in her separate notebook, the number she had not yet said out loud to anyone. Clifton Barr was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he opened the manila envelope and went through the contents methodically, the photographs, the notarized statement, the dates. He held the photograph of the power of attorney document up to the window, the way Roger Penton had held her $12 check in the assessor's office 3 months ago, and she noticed that both men had made the same gesture with different expressions. He set the photograph down. He said, "Dale filed a petition claiming your grandfather lacked testamentary capacity. What you have just given me is contemporaneous, notarized evidence that Dale's father committed document fraud against your grandfather in 2009. He looked across the desk at her. "That is not a defense. That is a counterclaim, and it substantially undermines the credibility of anyone Dale might bring to support his capacity argument." "I know," Nora said. "If Gareth Mercer was willing to forge a power of attorney," Clifton Barr said, "a jury is going to ask what else members of that family were willing to do and why." "I know," Nora said again. Clifton Barr looked at the letter. He had read it while she sat across from him, all 4 pages slowly. She had watched his face change in small ways while he read, the professional stillness, shifting slightly the way a person's face shifts when they encounter something that moves them unexpectedly. He said he knew Dale would come. Yes, he prepared for it. For years, he put the evidence in the one place Dale would never look, and the one place you would eventually find. Yes. Clifton Barr set the letter down. He said quietly, as though to himself as much as to her, "I have been practicing law for 31 years. I have never had a client hand me something like this." Between the morning in Clifton Barr's office and the day of the hearing, Nora went back to work. She finished the remaining sections of the property according to the notebook's grid. She found the 9th can near the northern fence line, the 10th in the soft ground along the old drainage ditch at the southeastern corner. The 11th she found under the concrete block that served as the step to the barn side door, a location so obvious in retrospect, so directly underfoot every time she had entered the barn for 4 months, that she stood looking at it for a full minute before she started digging. Aware that Elias had chosen it deliberately, that he had a sense of humor about these things that he had never allowed to surface in conversation. She had all 11 cans assessed by Diane Kowalski, who ran a licensed precious metals evaluation and purchase operation from a narrow storefront on Burnside Avenue in Portland. Diane Kowalski was 50 years old and had the calm professional manner of someone who handled significant value on a daily basis and had long since stopped being surprised by what people brought through her door. The assessment took 2 full days. When Diane Kowalski called with the final figure, Nora wrote it down on the back of a gas station receipt and folded the receipt into her coat pocket and drove home. She did not take the receipt out again for 3 days. She was not ready to look at it directly yet. She knew what it meant, and she needed to be entirely calm before she did anything with the knowledge. It was enough to retire the $73,000 bank debt 6 times over. And there was still the 19 acres of ground that had been producing at the rates documented in Elias's notebook for 30 years and was still producing now. She called Stuart Felling at Cascade Regional Bank on a Thursday morning. She said she would be coming in on Friday to settle the account in full. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough to be informative. "In full," he said. "In full," she confirmed, and hung up before the conversation could develop further. She drove to Portland, collected a cashier's check from Diane Kowalski's account, and stopped at the bank on the way home. Stuart Felling came out from his office to meet her at the teller window, something he had not done on any of her previous visits, which had been characterized by polite but pointed letters and the occasional phone call with a tone that suggested patience was a finite resource. She handed him the check. He looked at it for a moment. He said something that was designed to sound warm and professionally gracious and emerged instead as the sound of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation very quickly. She thanked him for the bank's patience, which overstated things, and drove home. The court hearing was held in the Clatsop County Courthouse on a Wednesday morning in late May. Clifton Barr was thorough and unhurried, which was how he operated in all circumstances, and which Nora had come to understand was one of the things that made him good at his work. He entered the notebook into evidence. He entered the 1891 survey map. He entered Elias's notarized sworn statement from 2009 and the photographs of the forged power of attorney document. He called Frances Ogle as a witness. Frances Ogle was 71 years old and appeared in the courtroom in a gray wool suit and reading glasses she wore on a silver chain, and she answered every question Clifton Barr asked in the precise, clear, unhurried way of a woman who has spent decades notarizing important documents and understands exactly what precision in language means and what it costs when it is absent. She confirmed the date. She confirmed that Elias Caldwell had appeared before her in March of 2009. She confirmed that she had notarized the sworn statement at his request. She said when asked to describe his mental state at that time, that he had been the most methodical and clear-thinking person she had notarized for in more than 20 years of practice. She said it without emphasis, as though it were simply a fact, which it was. Dale's attorney brought a physician who had treated Elias in the final 18 months of his life and had prepared testimony regarding cognitive decline. The physician testified. Then Clifton Barr produced the will's addendum, written in September 2017, legally precise, and notarized the document that read, "I have considered the question of Dale Mercer and Gareth Mercer carefully and at length. My decision is final." Clifton Barr asked the physician whether a person experiencing the degree of cognitive decline he had described would be capable of writing that sentence. The sentence with its specific names, its explicit acknowledgement of deliberation, its formal finality. The physician looked at the sentence for a long time. He said he could not testify that they would not. Dale's attorney had not been expecting that answer. The judge denied the petition. In the corridor outside the courtroom afterward, Dale stood near the elevator in his gray suit with his hands at his sides and looked at Nora with an expression she studied for a moment before she understood it. He had looked at the debt in the age and the swamp that nobody had wanted, and he had seen the solution to a problem that would solve itself if he waited long enough. He had not seen the notebook. He had not seen the key in the heel of the boot. He had not seen the metal box at the base of the basalt outcrop or the manila envelope inside it, with his father's initials written on the front, in the handwriting of a man who had been waiting for 38 years to let that particular piece of patience do its work. He had not seen Nora. She walked past him to the elevator. She did not say anything. She pushed through the lobby doors into the May afternoon, the air soft and warm and carrying the smell of the Douglas firs that grew along the creek behind the courthouse. The first real warmth of the year, the county going green in the way coastal Oregon goes green in late May, everything at once an insistence. 2 weeks later, the Oregon State Bar received a formal complaint filed by Clifton Barr on behalf of Nora Caldwell, citing the photographs, the notarized statement, and the court record referencing Dale Mercer's role in and knowledge of the 2009 document fraud. Gareth Mercer, who was 71 and had been monitoring the proceedings from his home in Portland, did not contest the complaint's factual foundation. Dale's law license was suspended pending investigation. Nora heard about it on a Tuesday evening and set her phone on the kitchen table and looked out the window at the barn and the lower field and the swamp beyond the fence line visible in the evening light as a dark mass of cattails and willows and standing water and black Oregon mud. She sat with it for a while. She did not feel the large, conclusive thing she had imagined she might feel at this moment, the thing that resolves into certainty and closure. She felt instead something smaller and more durable. The way the air feels after a storm has moved through when everything is still wet and the pressure has changed and breathing is different than it was an hour before. She went outside. The six bred heifers arrived on a Friday in early June. They came off a livestock trailer from a dairy operation 2 counties south, loaded in the morning and driven up through the Coast Range, arriving in the early afternoon with the calm, self-possessed temperament of animals who are accustomed to being moved and have learned that new places usually turn out to be acceptable. They walked down the ramp one by one into the lower field and spread out into the grass with the deliberate, unhurried movement of animals, establishing their relationship to a new territory. Nora stood at the fence and watched them settle. She had named them before they arrived. She had known the first names since the night she sat in the root cellar on the cold stone steps with her phone's light in her lap and 17 jars arranged on the shelves in front of her, and understood for the first time the full scale and intention of what Elias had built. The first heifer off of the trailer was dark red, a deep mahogany color that caught the afternoon light with a white patch above her left eye. She walked to the near corner of the field and put her head down in the grass with the absolute concentration of an animal that has found what it needs and intends to use it. Her name was Iris, Elias's wife, dead since 1989 before Nora was born, a woman she knew only through two photographs on the wall of the upstairs hallway and through the stories Elias had told, always sideways, always briefly, always in the middle of something else, the way he told everything that mattered to him. Iris Caldwell, who had kept the farm's accounts for 30 years without an error, who had put up 30 jars of preserves each fall and known the name of every bird that used the backfield and kept the kitchen garden running through droughts that killed everyone else's, who had been in Elias's telling the kind of person who made the people around her believe they were more capable than they had previously thought. The heifer that bore her name ate grass in the corner of the field with complete contentment. Nora repaired the barn roof in July. She had been tarping the compromised section since December, the blue tarps holding through the winter and spring rains, but not indefinitely, and she hired 2 men from Vernonia who worked without unnecessary conversation and finished in 3 days. She stood in the yard on the last afternoon and looked up at the clean new metal on the south-facing slope, bright in the summer sun, and then at the rest of the barn, which was old and sound and exactly what it had always been, and thought that this was the right proportion. You fixed what needed fixing. You left what was working alone. In August, she rebuilt the gate at the end of the driveway. It was the gate Elias had hung in 1981, the year the letter in the metal box had been written, the year he had hidden the brass key in the heel of his left boot and put it on the mudroom shelf and gone on with his life. The gate's hinges had rusted through, and the wood had warped, and the latch no longer caught. She disassembled it carefully, keeping the original boards, sorting out which ones had enough integrity to reuse and which needed to be replaced. She replaced only the ones that needed it. She cut new posts and set them 2 feet deeper than the originals, mixed the concrete herself, and let it cure for 3 days before hanging the gate. She plumbed it with a level, adjusting the hinges until the gate swung freely and the latch caught clean. She swung it open and closed 6 times. It was the same gate. It would hang for another 40 years. The people of Vernonia had been watching the way small towns watch quietly and over time, and without announcing their conclusions until they have formed them fully. The woman at the feed store, who had asked every January and February morning how Nora was holding up, had stopped asking sometime in April, which was not indifference, but its opposite, the recognition that the question was no longer necessary. Wendell Spruce at the hardware store had begun setting things aside for her without being asked lumber and fasteners, and the specific grades of hardware she had come to use the way he did for farmers whose needs had become predictable to him. Pastor Elwood, driving past on an afternoon in July, had rolled his window down and said only that it was good to see the Caldwell place looking cared for, and had driven on without waiting for a response. She was becoming, in the eyes of the county, a person who belonged here. It happened in increments she didn't mark individually, and when she looked back later, she couldn't identify the specific moment it became true. On a Thursday evening in September, she went to the root cellar. The jars were gone. She had removed them in stages after Diane Kowalski's assessment, each one wrapped carefully in dish towels and carried to the truck and driven to Portland over several trips. The wooden shelves were still there, the 3 boards Elias had fitted into the limestone walls sometime in the decades before she was born. The cinder blocks sat at the side of the propped open door. The stone steps descended into the cool, dry dark below. She went down. She did not take out the flashlight. She sat on the bottom step in the dark, letting her eyes adjust until she could make out the shelves in the faint light from the open door above her. The wood was pale where the jars had stood, slightly darker at the edges, where the air had touched it over the years. The shelves were empty, and they looked in the faint light like something that had accomplished its purpose and was now at rest. She thought about Elias coming down these steps. Not once, but dozens of times over 30 years each time, carrying something Akin cleaned and sealed, a jar filled and lidded the accumulated yield of one season's careful work. Setting it on the shelf with whatever care a man brings to something he is placing somewhere for a very long time. Going back up the steps, closing the door, living his ordinary life above it, not telling anyone, not spending any of it, not allowing himself the satisfaction of knowing that when he died, it would be found not directly, not by any simple means, but found eventually by someone willing to do the work of understanding what he had left and what it meant and where it pointed. He had done it for her, not abstractly, not for whoever might come, for her specifically. The notebook was not a general record. It was a document designed for a particular kind of reader, someone methodical and curious and willing to do the physical work of understanding something that didn't explain itself quickly. Someone who would buy 19 acres of swamp for $12 because the same thing had been done before and because the person who did it first had been worth paying attention to. The letter had said it plainly. The notebook had said it first in the language of gravel bars and water flow and seasonal yield, a language legible only to someone who had decided that attention was something worth giving to this piece of ground and this record of it. She had paid attention. She sat on the bottom step until the cold of the stone came through her jeans and made itself known, then climbed the stairs. She stood in the yard in the September evening, the light low and golden in the way of coastal Oregon in late summer, slanting through the firs at the property edge and lying flat across the field in long, warm bars. The heifer named Iris was at the near end of the lower field close to the fence, her head up watching Nora with the calm, direct attention of an animal that has made its assessment and found nothing requiring concern. Nora looked back at her. The land was quiet. The barn roof caught the light on the south slope clean and new. The gate at the end of the drive stood square and plumb, swinging easy on its new hardware, doing what it had been built to do. She put her hand in her coat pocket. The brass key was there where it had been since March, carried every day, in the same pocket, the metal worn smooth at the bow from decades in Elias's possession, and then the months in hers warm from her body heat, shaped to nothing except itself and to the specific padlock it had always been made for. She turned it in her fingers. Root cellar. You earned it, not a gift. The word gift implies something given without cost, something that passes from one hand to another through the simple willingness of the giver. This was not that. This was something she had earned by coming back, by staying, by paying attention to what most people had looked at and decided was worthless. She had earned it the way Elias had earned the right to buy 19 acres of swamp in 1968 for $11.50 and spend 30 years understanding what everyone else had missed. Some things are better resolved by the land than by the law. She thought about that sentence. She thought about Dale Mercer standing in the corridor outside the courtroom with his hands at his sides. She thought about the look on his face, which was not exactly defeat, because defeat implies that you had understood correctly what you were trying to win. What she had seen on his face was something more specific. The recognition that he had been reading an entirely different situation than the one that actually existed for so long, and with such confidence that the correction, when it came, arrived not as a loss, but as a revelation of how mistaken he had been from the beginning. He had looked at the land and seen a problem. Elias had looked at the same land and seen something worth understanding. That difference had taken 50 years to fully express itself. She closed her hand around the key. The evening was going fast, the gold light thinning, the temperature dropping in the small increments that meant fall was settling in on its usual schedule, patient and indifferent and absolutely reliable. The heifers in the lower field had begun moving toward the barn, As the light faded the way they moved each evening, now establishing the rhythm of a place they had decided to stay in. She had things to do before dark. She put the key back in her pocket. She looked one more time at the empty root cellar door propped open with the cinder block, the stone steps descending into the dark below the house she was going to live in for the rest of her life. Then she walked toward the barn across the frost-coming ground in the last of the September light.